Well, we want to look at Yeshua here in John chapter 6 as Lord over everything. I like that. Here's a map of the Sea of Galilee. Kind of reminds me of a harp. And John 6, verse 1, after these things, Yeshua went away to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, which is also called the Sea of Tiberias. After these things, after earlier things that had been talked about in John chapter 5. And the Sea of Galilee is very important in the Gospels because really most of Yeshua's ministry was conducted on and around the Sea of Galilee. And it's actually known by several different names, and you do find some of these names elsewhere in the scriptures and in other writings. Chinnereth is the word used by Josephus and the Hebrew Bible. And Josephus also uses the Hellenized version, Gennesar and Gennesaritis, which kind of sounds like a skin condition. But in the Gospels, it's normally the Sea of Galilee, and that's what we're calling it. Sometimes it's called the Sea of Tiberias because there's the town of Tiberias on the shore. And so sometimes the sea is named after that. And as I mentioned, most of Yeshua's ministry happened here. There's several things that are very unique about the Sea of Galilee. Here's a sign on the shoreline declaring that the Sea of Galilee is 700 feet below sea level. It is, in fact, the lowest freshwater lake in the world, and I think that's quite a distinction. It's quite a large lake or sea. It's 13 miles from north to south, which when you're thinking about this sea being in the Middle East, which is a very arid part of the world, that's quite large. And it's 7.5 miles from east to west. And the lake's total area is 64 square miles, which is not a small footprint, quite big, with a circumference of about 32 miles. And it's as deep as 200 feet in some places. So this gives us an idea of the Sea of Galilee and what it was like. Now we have some more. The mountains rise quickly from the sea. So the sea is very low, but it goes up quickly into the mountains. John 6, 2 through 4 is talking about this. It says, a great multitude followed him, Yeshua, because they saw his signs which he did on those who were sick. Yeshua went up into the mountain, and he sat there with his disciples. Now the Passover, the Jewish festival, was at hand. So we have a number of different things in this particular verse. We have Yeshua going up into the mountain. And he has a great multitude following him because they saw his signs and what he did for the sick. You know, that doesn't mean that they were his disciples or wanted to be his disciples. It means, perhaps, that they were fascinated by what he was doing. In some cases, it may be that they were drawn to his message. But it doesn't seem to be that. It seems to be they were drawn to his signs that he was doing. So he went up into the mountain. Perhaps he thought that if he went up into the mountain, some of them would, who were kind of less interested, would sort of pull away. But we find later there was a lot of people still there. And he sat up in the mountain with his disciples. And no doubt then the multitude came up around them. And it says the Passover, the Jewish festival, was at hand. Now, isn't that a curious way of putting that? Because we know John, the disciples, Yeshua, they were all Jews, right? So why is he specifically naming it the Jewish festival? I think it's because in saying the Jewish festival, he's referring to the festival as it's kept by the majority of the Jews, which suggests to me that it was kept differently by Yeshua and the disciples. This may have included timing issues sometimes, for example, and perhaps some rabbinical customs had come in to the festival of the Jews that was different than what Yeshua and his disciples did. We know when we read the Passover story of how Yeshua celebrated the Passover, we don't find it loaded with any Jewish rituals of any kind. And so it's very simple, and that's certainly a difference than how the festival was kept back in those days. In John chapter 5, it's around the time of the Passover. Here, starting in John chapter 6, a whole year has gone by. So John leaves out an entire year of Yeshua's ministry and jumps ahead to the point where the next Passover is about to happen. It's because John has a particular theme in mind that he's illustrating. Later in the book of John, near the end, he basically said Yeshua did so many things, all the books in the world couldn't hold it. So you have to leave stuff out, don't you? And therefore, John zeroed in on those things that helped to illustrate the point he was getting across. What was his point? His theme is the Son of God, the Lord of all creation. And we find that theme right in the very beginning of the book of John. We read this earlier tonight with Brother Roy. It tells us about the Word who was with and who was Elohim, who made all things. It tells us he was in the world, and the world was made through him, and the world didn't recognize him. And it says the Word became flesh and lived among us. We saw his glory, such glory as the one and only Son of the Father, full of grace and truth. What we find when we look at the book of John, right in the first chapter, is John, unlike the other Gospels, is especially highlighting this aspect of Yeshua, that he is the Son of God. And so the way John relates things in his book, it's kind of different than the other Gospels. We're going to see that tonight as we look at how it explains about feeding the 5,000 and Yeshua walking on the water. It just leaves out the details that have to do with Yeshua as the Son of Man in these stories. And instead, it's showing us that Yeshua is the Son of God, that he made the world, and yet they didn't recognize him for who he was. This is what we're seeing as we go through the book of John, and particularly tonight's verses in chapter 6. Yeshua, therefore, lifting up his eyes and seeing that a great multitude was coming to him, said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread that these may eat?" This he said to test him, for he himself knew what he would do. He was always teaching his disciples, always helping them step up to another level. And that's what he was doing with his disciple Philip. Philip answered him, 200 denarii worth of bread is not sufficient for them, that every one of them may receive a little. This answer, I think, is pretty much a standard kind of answer. In other words, I don't have the money. I can't feed them, right? Check your resources. It's not there. I can't do it. 200 denarii being about a half a year's wages. You're off the hook. You don't have the money, you're off the hook. That's what it seems like. Philip didn't pass that test, by the way. Isn't that what we do so often? Check the money supply. If it's inadequate, we're off the hook. We don't have to help. We don't have to do what's being pointed out to us. But is that what people of faith should do? Should money really determine the Lord's work? I'm not saying we don't need it, but should that be the determining factor? Does the supply limit God? Oh, we never think that, do we? No. This reminds me of Numbers chapter 11. Perhaps you remember this. Moses was leading the people after the exodus from Egypt, and they went through a series of tests, not unlike the test that Philip faced. And Moses went through some tests. And I think it's kind of interesting that Moses himself had an answer that was very similar to the answer that Philip had. Moses said, "The people among whom I am are 600,000 men on foot, and you've said, I will give them flesh that they may eat a whole month. Small flocks and herds be slaughtered for them, to be sufficient for them. Shall all the fish of the sea be gathered together for them, to be sufficient for them?" It really sounds to me like Moses is saying, hey, we can't feed them flesh for a month. The supply is insufficient. And Yahweh said to Moses, has Yahweh's hand grown short? Now you will see whether my word will happen to you or not. Did you ever stop to think that when we don't believe in the provision of God, we're insulting him? Don't you think we should think that? Don't you think he thinks that? When we believe, we see great things happen. And, he doesn't have to do it in the way we think. Sometimes he does things differently than we think, but he still meets the need. In this case, he sent a wind that brought quail in from the sea into the camp. And it extended a whole day's journey on either side of the camp, these quail blowing in the wind. And there were so many of them, they piled up on the ground about 2 cubits off the ground. That's roughly 3 feet. There was so much quail to eat, the people literally could not eat all the quail. Did Moses see that coming? Nobody saw that coming. Yeshua is like his Father. He can supply what is needed in amazing ways. Now, earlier I enjoyed hearing Sister Janet talk about a way that Yahweh had supplied her need. And I think anyone that has followed him for any length of time has these stories, and they're pretty amazing sometimes of the things that he's done and how he's supplied the need. And one of my favorites from my own life is when I was a young person And at the time, I was out of work, had to pay the rent, needed groceries to feed the kids, and I didn't have any money. Well, I can't say I didn't have any money. I had like a few bucks left and a little bit of gas in my tank of my old beater car. So the thought came into my head. This is before the internet, okay? The thought came into my head, I think I'm going to go down to the bookstore and see if they have any kind of booklets or books or anything that'll give me an idea of something I can do immediately to be able to make this money that I need so that I can feed my kids and meet my obligation. So I went down to the bookstores in this strip mall, parked in the parking lot, went in to try and find something that would help me. And I didn't really find anything that was going to work. And I came out and I looked at my car, and another car had rolled across the parking lot a long distance. It had rolled out of its parking place a long distance and ran into the back door of my car. So it was kind of strange. So there's a little dent in the back door of my car. So I looked around, and all of a sudden the people came who owned this car, which happened to be a really nice car. And they came over to me, and they said, well, we're so sorry about what happened with our car. We really don't want to have to call the police or anything or report this because it'll make our insurance go up. How about we just give you some money to cover the cost of your dent here? And I said, well, what do you have in mind? And they reached into the pocketbook and pulled out a handful of $100 bills and handed it to me. And I said, well, thank you very much. That should be fine. And then, of course, I thanked my Father in heaven. That's how he supplied my need on that day. And you know what? Just like with the 5,000, I ended up with more than enough, more than what I was looking for. I just think that is amazing, how he can supply our needs. Well, let's look at this now a little more closely. One of the disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, there is a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, but what are these among so many? So I think Andrew is saying this to say, well, this is how little we really have. And again, an excuse why we can't do anything. But instead, Yeshua is about to grab onto this to teach us important lessons. And of course, as Brother Roy pointed out, these numbers are significant. We have 5 loaves of bread and the bread of life. It's in the Torah, isn't it? And 2 fish, the 2 houses of Israel. And isn't that an interesting picture? Because with the Lord's help, his little nation of Israel can feed the world. Just like that little boy. Which, by the way, can you imagine what that little boy thought when he gave his lunch to Yeshua and it ended up feeding over 5,000 people? Wouldn't you have loved to be that little boy? I think that's just such a fantastic thing. And it also shows something about Yeshua. You know, he created the world, and he didn't need our help to do it. But ever since he's put us here on this planet, he likes doing stuff with us, right? He could just do it. He doesn't need us. And yet, that's his heart. He wants to do it with us. So he could have just created the fish and the bread. He didn't need those 2 fish and those 5 loaves, but he included what the little boy had to bring, even though it's so little. And that's what he can do with you. That's what he can do with me. We might not think we've got much that we can bring to him, and yet, if we'll just do it, we see amazing miracles happen. Amazing things. Yeshua said, have the people sit down. There was a lot of grass there. So the men sat down, numbering about 5,000. It's likely the total number of people was much higher because of women and children. So it was probably quite a huge number of people. And look at how Yeshua handled things. He took the loaves and he gave thanks. Now, the rabbinical custom is you eat the food, then you give the thanks. Yeshua gave the thanks first and then ate the food. Which custom should we follow? Any doubt? You know, this is how miracles happen, by the way, from a thankful heart. If we thank Yahweh first, that's how we see miracles happen. So after he gave thanks, he distributed to the disciples. Again, including the people, right? Including the people. It's not just something he was doing. He likes to work in partnership with you. With you. And with me. It's what he likes. Don't ask me why. It's just how he is. So that's what he did. He distributed it to the disciples, and then in an orderly way, the disciples distributed it to all those who were sitting down. And it tells us about this, implying it's both the bread and the fish. People had all they wanted. He didn't say, well, we've just got enough fish here, you can have this little bit, and you can just have this little bit of bread. None of that. They were all filled. They were all given all that they wanted. There is no shortage. There is no difficulty with our Father in heaven supplying all of our needs. He has more than enough. The whole universe is his. We have to trust him. In fact, when it was all over, we had this. After they were all filled, he said to his disciples, gather up the broken pieces which are left over, that nothing be lost. So they gathered them up and filled 12 baskets with broken pieces from the 5 barley loaves, which were left over by those who had eaten. Gather up the broken pieces which are left over, that nothing be lost. These broken pieces, in the 12 baskets, they picture the broken ones. The remnant of Israel are broken. We're afflicted in the exile. I think it's amazing that in this great deed that the Son of God did, he's actually remembering the remnant. That nothing be lost, he says. None of his little ones will be lost. And even right now, the Good Shepherd is out there wandering around into all of the forgotten corners of this world, seeking out all of his remnant. That's what he's doing. Some of them are reluctant to come because they're so broken. It's hard for them to come. But he has patience for them, and he is gathering them. So they gathered them up and filled 12 baskets with broken pieces from the 5 barley loaves, which were left over by those who had eaten. 12 baskets. Of course, that's the 12 tribes. And the broken pieces, what can that be but the remnant This is what's left over, the remnant. And of course, this points forward to the final day. So look at what Yeshua is doing here. Not only is he meeting the need of the multitude who were Israelites 2,000 years ago, but isn't he meeting a spiritual need of ours to tell us in this miracle that he cares? Only God can do that. Here in the book of John, this act of multiplying the loaves and fishes is presented as a creative act. It's following up on John chapter 1, where it presents Yeshua as the creator. This isn't magic, right? Magic doesn't exist, actually. This is what Yeshua did back at the beginning when the earth was created. This is actually creating something. 5 loaves of bread and 2 fishes. That's what you had to start with. Obviously, there's a lot more being created here by Yeshua. It's showing us that Yeshua is the Lord over creation that we find in the creation account in Genesis 1. That's what it's telling us. What about you and me? Could we do the same thing? Could we multiply bread and fish? Could Elon Musk do it? What do you think? You know, even with all of the scientific advances today, this is still beyond, isn't it? It's above and beyond what can be done. Now, we could do this. We could do this on 2 conditions. One, that it was the will of our Father to do it, and the other, that we would trust him to do it. But then it wouldn't really be us doing it, would it? It would be the Creator doing it. And our role would be faith, trusting. He would be the enabler to make it happen. Yeshua is the Lord over everything. And he wants to partner with us in doing amazing things. When therefore the people saw the sign which Yeshua did, they said, "This is truly the prophet who comes into the world." Yeshua therefore, perceiving that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, withdrew again to the mountain by himself. Well, isn't that what he wanted, to be king? That's what some people would think. But you see, Yeshua is so different from all of those would-be messiahs because he doesn't need to be elected. He's not going to be king by popular vote. He's king now by virtue of the fact that it's his universe. So, while we see so many, including Bible teachers, by the way, that prostitute themselves to get the approval of men, Yeshua never did that. And whenever that was about to happen, he headed in the other direction. And if we are representing him in this world, shouldn't we do the same thing? In the kingdom, politicking for advancement is simply not the way we do things. It's not how it works. It's not how Yeshua did it. It's not how his apostles did it. It's not how Yahweh does it. It's a kingdom. It comes from the top down, and it's Yahweh who has the plan. It's Yeshua who executes the plan, and he chooses who he will to do whatever they do. And doesn't that make things simple for us? Because all we really have to do is just perceive what he's doing through faith and cooperate with him. That's really all it takes. And that's pretty wonderful. Well, what happened after this? When evening came, his disciples went down to the sea, and they entered into the boat and were going over the Sea of Capernaum. It was now dark, and Yeshua had not come to them. So it's kind of interesting now as we're going into this story. You're going to notice some differences from this story to what we've read in the other Gospels. And I'm really glad that Brother Roy covered that so well, showing what Yeshua was doing as the Son of Man in these very same incidents. Because, as happens with witnesses, witnesses have different points of view for the same events. John is presenting a different point of view that was needed at the time he wrote this gospel, seeing who Yeshua was as the Son of God. And this is what we're going to see as we look at John's version of this story. And so as evening comes, we have Yeshua on the mountain, no doubt praying. We have the disciples going down to the sea, about to cross over to Capernaum. It's dark, and they're probably wanting to get some shut-eye, so they're headed to Capernaum, which was their base of operations. Let's talk a little bit more about the Sea of Galilee. I like this picture. Here is where the Jordan River enters the Sea of Galilee, near ancient Bethsaida. And this is the main source of water for the lake. A lot of this comes down from Mount Hermon and the other mountains around there. And it supplies about 75% of the lake's intake of water. Comes down through there. Here's another part of our story. I hope you can see it because it's not real well defined in the picture, but this is a reconstruction of a first century boat, and it's based on a first century boat that was actually excavated from the northwestern shore of the Sea of Galilee. And of course, it was not in this kind of condition when they excavated it, but there was enough there for them to see what that boat was like. Now, when you look at this boat, it's not very big, is it? It really isn't very big. It does have a sail, no doubt some paddles in there. And having these details, we look at John 6:18. The sea was tossed by a great wind blowing. Violent storms are caused by the fierce winds which blow off the Golan Heights from the east. One such storm in March 1992 sent waves 10 feet high, causing significant damage to the city of Tiberias. It's just so hard for me to imagine on a lake waves 10 feet high. This is not normally what you see on a lake, but it's because of the unusual circumstances of this lake being so low below sea level, and then these mountains and the wind rushing down over the mountains into the sea that causes this condition of these storms that can come up suddenly. And you don't even see this coming. And boom, there are these storms with these 10-foot waves. You know, that's That's bad on the ocean, let alone on a lake. It goes on, when therefore they had rowed about 25 or 30 stadia, 3 or 4 miles. That's not a long time, a long way. They saw Yeshua walking on the sea and drawing near to the boat, and they were afraid. I can understand that. It's pretty unusual. I don't think they were expecting to see that. And it made them fearful. I'm thinking they were probably already fearful of the storm. But then seeing this was a whole other level, right? Someone coming out walking across the waters of the storm. But he said to them, "It is I, don't be afraid." They were willing, therefore, to receive him into the boat. Immediately the boat was at the land where they were going. Did you notice what this account leaves out? Doesn't tell you anything about the part of what happened with Peter. Doesn't tell you about him stepping out of the boat, walking on the water a little bit, and then sinking. Doesn't give you any of that. John knew that was already there in the other Gospels. He just didn't include it. Why? Because he's emphasizing the divinity of Yeshua. So he's just leaving everything else out of the story except Yeshua and what Yeshua did. As if to direct your attention, look at this. Here's this man walking across the water in a storm. What do you make of that? John is saying Yeshua is the Lord over the wind and the waves. That's the conclusion he drew by what he saw. That's what he's reporting to us. I think it's also interesting, if we follow this creation theme, we have Yeshua walking across these waters. It kind of reminds you about the Holy Spirit hovering over the waters at the beginning of creation, doesn't it? Very similar picture. Or the waters of Noah's flood. Takes us back to the Torah and places Yeshua Messiah at the center. It's amazingly reassuring when you see that you know him. And even more important, that he knows you. That's amazingly reassuring. He said, "It is I, don't be afraid." They recognized his voice. They recognized his voice. They did have a relationship with him. Once they recognized his voice, they received him into the boat. I think that's great. That's what we need to do, right? We need to recognize his voice and receive him into our boat, and everything will be fine. Immediately, the boat was at the land where they were going. No rowing. He gets in the boat is at their destination. Space and time mean nothing to the Creator. Again, showing him as Lord over everything. Not only over the wind and the waves, but over space and time. As the Son of God, he is, in fact, eternal. He can do this stuff. He can. The picture is Yeshua is none other than the divine Son of God. That's the picture we see. Do we need this picture? You know, last week we presented a picture showing what the elite are planning and what they are doing today. And many people view the things they're doing as modern miracles. And sometimes we as believers can even feel intimidated by some of these things as we see them building the beast, right? And all of this is growing. I'm thinking as we look at John chapter 6, we see Yeshua, the divine Son of God. We should realize we don't have a thing to worry about because we've got him. And what they're able to do, from a human standpoint, it's very impressive. No question. I'm impressed. It's very impressive. Compared to the creator of the universe, nothing. It's nothing. He can bring us through the things that are ahead. And if, like his disciples, we hear his voice and we let him in our boat, it's all going to work out fine.
For whatever things were written before were written for our learning, that we, through the patience and comfort of the Scriptures, might have hope. You know, the apostles, they were Torah scholars. This is why I'm doing Tsiyon Academy. The lessons include 2-hour audio programs and quiz modules. All the lessons in the Torah can be applied to us today. Not to mention, they open up the renewed covenant scriptures in a whole new level, much like the apostles had understanding of the Torah. Plus, I can do the courses in my own time, at my own pace, with no prerequisites, and at a very low cost. I can do them here. Or here.
Tsiyon Academy students are provided with study materials, the Tsiyon Messianic Scriptures, in-depth verse-by-verse programs, and quizzes with your final grade and a certificate at the end of the course. Tsiyon Academy also offers assignments for students who would like to opt in to take part in the Tsiyon Tabernacle live Shabbat meetings. Become immersed in the Torah. Find out how you can become a Tsiyon Academy student at tsiyon.org.
Was this video informative? Click the like button below to help spread the word to others. Feel free to leave a comment and share your thoughts. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you won't miss out on more amazing content from Eliyahu Ben David.